All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to this latest edition of the Value and Energy Data webinar series at the Energy Systems Catapult. My name is Jessica Steinemann, and I'm the Data and Analytics Practice Manager here at the Catapult. Before we get started, and whilst the last few people are joining, just a few housekeeping rules to remind everyone of. This session will be recorded and will be put on YouTube afterwards. So we ask everyone to please keep your cameras off and also turn your microphone off. We can use the chat for questions or comments, and I will go through these as the team are presenting and kind of moderate a bit of a Q&A session afterwards. So having said that, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce you to today's speakers and today's topic. With us today, we've got Professor Adrian Friday, who is a Professor of Computing and Sustainability at Lancaster University, together with his team, Dr. Christian Remy, Dr. Oliver Bates, and Dr. Christina Bremer, who are designers and researchers who've been doing research on making data science tools more usable for people, especially working with energy and net zero data. And the session today will be telling you about how data science can transform commercial energy demand. So very excited to learn more about that. Over to you, Adrian, Christian, Oliver, and Christina.
Thank you very much. See if I can share these.
Yeah, they've come up perfect.
Great. Excellent. You got the control over there. Yep. Yep. Hi everyone, it's great pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay? Someone do a thumbs up. We've got a thumbs up. Fantastic. So we're going to be reflecting on a project we're just coming to the end of, which had a sort of pretty bold vision, I think, about working with I have to do that one, which is partly bringing disciplines together. So trying to bring statistical techniques and time series statistical techniques with a bit of social geography from Ali Gourmali, who's not with us today, and sort of computer science, HCI, to say, you know, how do we make sense of a deluge of data that's coming from the sort of energy meters and building management systems in most sort of commercial premises, and how can we sort of learn from that? I guess our motivation as a team is we've done lots of work with sort of energy in communities, particularly on our university campus, which we're going to mainly speak about today. You know, this was from a project on the island of Tyree, looking at the time, the sort of marginal demand of renewables and how does everyday life fit with that. We've done work on things like direct energy in cooking and embodied energy of diet, and which is more substantial. We've done work on thermal comfort, which is obviously a very big energy demand and very important for decarbonisation and energy transitions, and various projects trying to engage people about changing their practice and not relying so much on the technology. But the other thing we're concerned in is digital technology, and does that deliver on the sort of potential? You often see AI is growth in data centers, for example. It's growing energy demand, material demands of ICT. It's globally significant. We've done work on that. But you see a lot of things like this. You know, AI is going to save us by helping us find opportunities in our energy data. Digital twins are going to save us by helping us optimize what we're currently doing. But I think that my starting point is always this kind of thing. If we look at the world trying to get together to do net zero, to address climate change, what you've got up the y-axis is parts per million of CO2, and you can see from the curve, the x-axis is time. You can see that, you know, the amount of carbon concentrations are going up and up and up, and the accords are happening, but it's still growing. And then the colours just represent how the warming above average temperature. So you can see it's just getting warmer. So there's an urgency to this, and that motivates us very strongly. And if you look at sort of emissions versus where we need to get to, you can see that's a hell of a curve we've got to climb down. This is not about doing what we currently do and doing what we currently do, you know, a small percentage more efficiently. It's about really doing things radically differently and with much less energy demand. And the point I like to make here is this is a race where acting early is better than acting late. So we're still seeing a rise in emissions that have happened over the past decades. Greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time. There's a long lag in this. So as we add technology, they need to be massively reducing emissions that we're doing now. And that little tiny diagram there with the green circle, that's about the safe operating space for humanity. We need to be not exceeding all these kind of various bounds and sort of driving towards that. So anyway, this project, which deals much more with energy than things like our supply chains, was really formed around this notion that we wanted replicable energy savings. We wanted to be able to spot where interventions at an organisational level had led to a substantial reduction in energy demand and spot that change point in the data. And then could we recommend that to apply elsewhere and to other organisations? So it's quite a sort of bold ambition, really. And we had these sort of three assertions. That a lot of data already exists within the sort of information systems of organisations, if only we can kind of get at it. That these sort of new statistical methods can help us find these kind of insights, and that we can help stakeholders understand their estates better and make energy savings more quickly and more rapidly. Okay, so we're going to mainly talk about the project had several partners, BT, Tesco, Best Energy, and various other, and the university facilities. We're mainly going to be talking about the most complex example that we have good inverted commas data for, which is our university campus. This is it. It's in the northwest of England, right on the west coast. It's a self-contained town in a way. It has a lot of mixed-use buildings. And more importantly, I guess, for our challenge, it has thousands of channels of heterogeneous data. And we have we're on 7 years of data, I think. So sort of millions of data points to try and make sense of. That's my slide. Okay, sorry, that's the other partners. We're not going to talk about, we could talk about, but we're not going to talk about the other work we've done with the other partners really today. Okay. Right, I think I'm going to hand over to Christian.
All right, thank you very much, Edin. All right, so when we started the project, obviously we did our research and looked, what existing industry standards are there to explore energy data. And here are some examples. What the Power BI, Grafana, Energy Dashboard.co.uk, and Tableau, which are some of the most popular sort of industry standards for exploring energy data. And this is more or less the vision. What could be one potential output of the project if we could get something like this, but more tailored towards what we need. But once we started exploring the data that Adrian mentioned earlier, this is more what we're looking at. Some data streams that were very difficult to interpret, like all over the place, or some completely off and making charts unreadable because they were so out, just the magnitude was just off. Or also some data streams were looking like this, just a zero, lots of long zero lines, or no data at all. And this was more or less the reality that we're facing. So why is this happening? And the reason for all those data problems is that it's manifold. But one is there's so many different meters, so many different systems. The meters are installed in a new building when a new building comes up, and then a new generation of meters comes along. And this is just an unedited list of the meters just from the system. It's a screenshot. There's 50 different meters of 100 different models in the entire system, and we have about 1,500 meter streams just from the university energy data, as an example. And as you can see, there's lots of different resolutions, scales, formats, and so on. And getting this all into one standard is very difficult because there isn't really a standard. I mean, in theory, there are industry standards, but in practice, they're just installed. They have to work, and there is not really the time and place to get this all unified into one system. But we needed one pipeline. So how do we get all of this from like different sources, like CSV dumps on some server, emails, log files, and existing data streams into one live API? So this is what we set out to do. But first, we need to get an overview of the different data types. And I'm not going to go over this in detail. You can read about this more in detail in a paper that's mentioned here at the bottom. But just to roughly put this into two groups, the different data types. The first one is time series data and the related information. You can see this in the screenshot on the right-hand side, which is the time series data, then the metadata, which describes what is in there, what type of data, where is it located and anything, and post-process data, which is, for example, summaries of the data, anomalies, or those kind of statistical insights. And this is the most common data that we look at, but this more describes the what does the data represent and what does it mean. But what's more important is oftentimes the context. So why is the data the way it is, right? What are the issues facing it? And there's many different types of context. You're going to hear context a lot in the remainder of this talk. But some examples are just like outputs or related policies about the data, or interviews that explain certain events that happened that relate to how the time series data changed, and so on. So to explore this, we built our own dashboard, and I'm just going to very briefly show you a couple of screenshots of some of those, of what the dashboard offers. So here you can see there's a map where you can explore the campus, and then you can select certain meters, build based on some factors, like select certain buildings, names, and so on, the time frame of data that you want to explore. And there's also different representations of the data. So for example, you can, instead of look at the map, you can list them by the consumption in like this sort of league table. Here it shows the intensity, which is the energy consumption divided by a square meter, which is one of the few industry standards that exist for how to explore data and kind of compare buildings with each other. And then you can click on one of those meters if you want and see some more detailed energy consumption. So you could just look at the energy consumption here, for example, aggregated by week to see how it changes over a week. But like I said, we really want to explore the context and go deeper and see like why are certain changes happening. And for this reason, we've implemented in the dashboard the option to annotate almost anything, at least in theory. That's the kind of vision. And here to show you an example of how this works. In this interface, you can just click on this button and then select where you see a change. For example, here, okay, that looks like something happened. And as we know, we installed something new, so we type something like, okay, here we installed some new radiators, and that's why the energy all of a sudden goes up by a lot. So what are some of the lessons learned from this interactive prototype that we built? So first of all, we have to admit, yes, we built another dashboard, and there are so many existing ones already, but there's lots of value for us in doing this, because it allowed us to focus on what are our particular research questions, what do we want to investigate. There's also a big value in doing this because we learned a lot by developing this dashboard, and what are the important features, what are some of the things we need to focus on. We actually gained a deeper understanding of the data and the problems of dealing with data, and how difficult it is to make the time series data and context and all the different data types that I mentioned before briefly, how to join them all up. And building our dashboard allowed us to really focus on unique opportunities, like what do we want to develop further and investigate further. There is also an interesting experience that we had, or an interesting lesson learned from the process, where we as HCI researchers, we go to talk to our users, do user studies, and they tell you like, oh, we really want this feature, for example, the map that I built and spent a lot of time on. And then after we built this, it turns out it's actually a nice feature to draw you into the prototype, but it's not being used after the first novel exploration phase, because it's more like a nice to have shiny feature, but it's not really what is needed for the day-to-day tasks. So it's a classical HCI example of build what the users need and not what they say what they need, which is not necessarily the same thing. And the last insight is really the context explorer, which is an absolute work in progress. And there are so many things you want to do. And one of the open questions that we still have is, how do we actually capture context? Because I just showed you how you can add context in there, but that was me doing this because I wanted to show this to you. But how do we on a daily basis and constantly capture context in situ when it's needed, and how do we have it available when we actually want this? And maybe a deeper question is, what is context anyway? So I gave you a few examples on one of those previous slides about what we consider context, but when talking to our stakeholders and looking up existing discussions about energy data, context means lots of different things to many different people. So yeah, that was my part. Thanks, Christian. I hand over to Christina.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah,
The keyboard.
the keyboard. So I'll talk in a little bit more detail about a part of our study that we didn't see coming really. When we started the project, obviously we didn't know that a pandemic would happen. But it turned out to be a really interesting opportunity, specifically with regard to buildings and their energy consumption. So many of the interventions that our stakeholders were implementing or that they envisioned to be implemented target the operational part of buildings. So really devices or systems that can be turned off, whereas many of the systems in buildings, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, are part of the base load, meaning that they cannot be turned off for a building to be operational. So security systems, for example, some servers, anything that needs to stay on for the building to work. So we designed a study that looked at the different periods of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see the different years here. So we had the year before the pandemic, 2019, as our baseline. Then we had 2020 with the strictest lockdown period. We had 2021 as a year where we're coming out of the pandemic, some of the regulations already lifted. And we had 2022 where things were more or less back to normal. Looking at the whole campus, as you can see here, this was the 2020 year, so the year where the pandemic first hit. You can see the drop in March, which was the onset of the first lockdown period in the UK. And you can see where over the next couple of months, really the consumption stayed lower than it was at the beginning and the end of the year, but there was still a substantial consumption. And I should highlight again, as Adrian already mentioned, we do have some residential buildings on campus, so the campus was not empty. We had some students at least staying here. We had some of the key staff staying here, but many people working from home and also many students returned to their home countries and didn't stay in Lancaster. We then selected a set of 19 buildings for which we had good data for all of those 4 years. As Christian said, not all of our buildings had consistently good data, but those 19 buildings did. And we found a really interesting pattern across many of those buildings. So here in the violin plot, you can see the consumption across those 4 years. That's the 5-week period I just showed you. And when we were analyzing the data, we found something we didn't expect, where some of the buildings actually had that decrease in energy consumption in 2020. So we said 10% is significant, where we say, okay, those were savings. Some buildings did not. So here, for example, you can see the library as a building that stayed on and stayed open. And we found no significant changes across all 4 of those years. However, we also found some buildings. Oh yeah, here's another example of a mix of offices and residential spaces where you can very clearly see the drop in 2020 when fewer people were in the buildings or some systems got turned off. We also had some buildings, interestingly, and that was not all of the buildings, but a subset. Oh. Now my keyboard won't work.
Screen.
Okay, so here you can see that in 2021, there was actually an increase in energy consumption. And again, we took 2019 as the baseline, and we said if 2021 was 10% higher than 2019, that's a significant increase. And we had a subset of buildings where this happened. Often went down again in 2022. And that triggered some investigation. Again, the context we were talking about earlier as to why. Speaking with energy managers and people on campus, we found that the air ventilation system were turned on max. Obviously, windows were kept open to reduce the virus load in buildings. So actually the systems were working harder. And despite fewer people being in the building, the energy consumption overall was higher. This only happened in non-residential spaces, supporting this hypothesis. And then,
Like the battery's going.
yeah, maybe the keyboard's given up. So just a quick overview. So when we then took the 2020 nighttime consumption as a base load of buildings, and those are not exact numbers, but just for an order of magnitude, and compared that with what was happening during the day in different years, then we found an average 20 to 23% decrease. So our working hypothesis is that this is the operational load of a building when no one's in the building or very few people are in the building, which kind of describes the potential for interventions that target operational savings. And I think that's just really important to recognize that if we have smart system, if we bring in systems that, kind of target behavior change, for example, it won't be able to reduce the consumption further than those 20 to 23%. We then, I just very quickly go into the qualitative part of the study, spoke with different energy professionals here on campus, experts who are involved in installing, maintaining, evaluating systems. And we found some tensions that we do think people should be aware of. This doesn't mean that these interventions won't work, but those are just challenges to really, I think,
we'll go for a walk in a minute.
Good. I think people still knackered.
So first we saw an increase in complexity, but the vision is still that the increase in complexity enables seamlessness, so that smart systems do things on their own, despite the fact that we need a lot more infrastructure, a lot more sensors, etc. Then the idea that energy professionals, energy managers, for example, would like to stay in control without actually interacting with the system, at least not frequently. So this links back to black box AI methods where really people are not fully aware of what's going on or don't have the time and energy to invest in understanding what's going on behind the scenes, but would still like to be able to act, for example, when something goes wrong. Also, there's often a negative narrative when it comes to occupant behavior. So occupants in buildings are often described as a problem, as the people who break the systems or who don't behave as they should be. The idea and response to this behavior is often to take away more control, to lock windows, to no longer give access to the heating system, for example, to kind of keep people, quote unquote, under control, which obviously is, from a social standpoint, is questionable, but also can trigger further kind of rebellious behavior, kind of bringing in electric heaters, for example. And maybe not an irony, but a paradox, a rebound effect, which we also saw on campus, where kind of making systems or devices more efficient can lead to a higher consumption overall when demand increases or when savings are reinvested. And that's also something to keep in mind, I think.
We'll try the keyboard again.
Okay.
Thank you. Cool. Right. So I guess bit of a switch of gear, but not entirely, because we're talking about context again. But context on our project seems to be, context is essential for finding value in energy data. It seems to be one of the key sort of elements or findings. We've been drawn to it as sort of something to analyze as well and think about. And this in part comes from our own observations, but also critiques from social scientists and design researchers around sort of like everything becoming very much about data and numbers, and there not being a lot of sort of integration or of inclusion of social science methods and sort of perspectives on energy demand in sort of the tools that are used by energy, energy decision makers and energy stakeholders. And so, yeah, just to sort of like riff on that a little bit, like it's been really interesting to sort of dig into what context is as a more qualitative aspect of energy consumption and energy demand. And so we've been thinking about just a list, I guess, different types of context building on what we've heard from Adrian, Christian, and Christina, like how things are used when people are in spaces, when spaces are open and closed. That's really useful information to understand if energy consumption is or isn't anomalous. But you need that data to be able to do that analysis. Knowing what you can turn on and off in a building as an energy stakeholder or as somebody working in a building day to day, that can be useful context for an energy intervention. Think about the history of the building, how that maybe has changed, how that's affected airflow and different things like that. It's useful. I'm just listing a bunch of things that are really useful to understand when thinking about energy interventions. But also, if you wanted to sort of like make any long-term changes or plans, like understanding the organizational needs and sort of like the policy approach to being a business or an organization is something that you will rub up against if you're trying to do energy interventions, because keeping customers happy and making sure that whatever your key service or product is can be produced or run is really important. And there just lies tension around reducing energy demand, which I don't think we often talk about explicitly. So yeah, I just wanted to raise that as something that we've seen and heard about. And I guess because we've been doing a lot of work around context and trying to dig into some of the complexity and what's going on underneath the data, we've had, this is just one anecdote from a paper that Adam, a colleague, led about energy consumption and heating and cooling. And we found that the BMS for this particular building, the building that we happen to be in right now, there's one temperature sensor that speaks to the BMS, and that controls the heating and cooling for the whole building, which is leading to a lot of overheating because that temperature sensor is in a lower floor in a cooler space. Part of the building is south facing, so it gets really, and it's all glass. You can see that glass there. So it gets really hot in the summer. And so the building management system thinks it's doing the right things, but people are really hot and complaining in those spaces. And it's just, if we hadn't done interviews, if we hadn't installed some sensors and talked to people, we wouldn't know that. And that's not always a tool that energy stakeholders are using, or that's not the default perspective, which is something I've been quite interested in exploring. And so working with our maths and stats colleagues, we've developed a number of data science tools for like probing complexity and context. Here's one that Paul developed around sort of like detecting anomalies and then labeling them, which has led to a number of like quite interesting conversations with the different stakeholders that we've been working with, both in terms of like us getting context from them. It's like, oh, that's where the laundry's done. So there's this big spike on a Wednesday and it always happens and blah, blah, blah. Because that's when people do their laundry because they're not in class or whatever on a campus, which is really rich information, but that's not always, that's not presented through like default ways that we look at through dashboards or quantitative time series analysis. And I've been doing a study over the last few months about how energy experts or people who are, consultants or like energy managers or facilities managers are like, what is context to them? How are they using that in their different settings, when they're helping organizations reduce their energy consumption and think about the future? And so just a few things I've learned, like everybody's doing it differently. They're collecting the data in their heads, in notebooks. It's like whatever data sources and sets and information they can use to sort of understand the patterns of energy consumption and make sense of it. They're gathering that sort of intuitive how they're doing that. Getting access to people who like work in an organization and build up that sort of organizational institutional knowledge and context takes a lot of time and effort, but is super valuable. this sort of contextual data about tech and energy, as Christian mentioned, it's not standardized. It often is in people's heads. We've described that sort of tacit knowledge that people have on different projects that we've done as sort of like as a Bible, but it's in someone's head. So we on a previous project about logistics, it was the driver's Bible, like the listed logistics driver's Bible. So here it's like an energy expert's Bible. And finally, like the organizational knowledge is not often written down, and it is very rarely machine readable. So like, I've got a great anecdote about this. Well, I think it's great. I wanted, just for doing some analysis on campus about when it open and close dates, and trying to understand what the baseload analysis that Christina was doing in a bit more of a programmatic way. I wanted to get the open and close dates, a data set on that for the campus for the last 7 or 8 years, and then compare it to some of the aggregate metadata that we had. I had to go through like 4 different people, a bunch of different email chains. I scraped the website, but like the historical data sort of gets lost. I think I ended up with a spreadsheet, a Word document, and some stuff off of a website, which sort of perfectly exemplifies a couple of these points. And I think there's a mission for the future about making this even simple contextual data that would be quite useful quite quickly, more readily available and accessible, and in a machine readable format. But the bit of work I've been doing, sort of inspired by some of these observations about social science and design research approaches not being part of energy management practice, is exploring through sort of different set of design probes, so like prototypes, what looking at energy reduction and energy in organizational context could look like in different kinds of ways. So big pause. Go. Yeah. So one of the things that I've developed with the designer is a speculative dashboard that sort of foregrounds the needs of the people and the groups that work in an organization. So here is a fictional sort of example of a dashboard. It's the contextual data view. You sort of log in as the energy stakeholder, and what you see is it's sort of automatically labeled what different people in the organization are doing, explaining, giving context or some sense to why there's certain peaks or troughs. For example, that on the left there's a big meeting that the marketing team are doing, so more energy is being used to like cool the space, for example. And like just imagining, like it's useful to sort of imagine what information or data we would need to sort of make sense of that and make decisions about how do we want to best use our energy, what is meaningful to individuals and the organization, and what's sort of essential. I think it's a useful conversation to be having. At the moment, I'm sort of developing some activities based off of some of the interviews. So research activities to help capture context or think about important contextual data in more structured ways, not necessarily machine readable, but a set of activities that an energy manager, energy analyst, or a researcher who's interested in energy could sort of like give to an energy stakeholder or some people who work in a space, then record their own data. Because I like the idea of, well, I think a lot of people work in organizations and they know a lot of stuff about how buildings are being used and their own personal needs. And that can be really useful and rich context to understand why there's certain peaks in demand or why there's rebound effects. Because if you're one energy manager or a small facilities team, you can't survey an entire campus or even a whole building and get like an accurate picture of what's going on there to understand what the energy demand is kind of composed of. This slide's sort of in the wrong place, but we'll just do a brutal context switch to something Adrian's going to say.
So I suppose where have we got to? In a sense, in delivering our vision, we found it was possible to detect anomalies in the energy data, but most of the data is complex because of its context. So when you compare 2 buildings, it turns out that one has flats on top, or one has meeting rooms, or one's running physics experiments. There's subtlety to how the buildings are used that means that a naive comparison of its overall energy use against some KPIs isn't meaningful. And as you sort of drill down, these concerns of, well, that building has one sensor and that one was built 20 years later and has 20 sensors, these start to become really important for sort of the dashboard view, because without it, you don't understand weaknesses to the assumptions you're making. But anyway, 3 useful things. Actually, just being able to fix your infrastructure is a useful thing. So if a lot of people are buying AI-based solutions, anomaly detection solutions based on machine learning, bad data in is bad recommendations. So fixing the data flows is actually quite critical and one of the easier things to spot, really. We think by applying simple kind of context, you can find the out-of-hours energy use. You can find these sort of classic areas which might be associated with high amounts of energy demand, like heating or heating spaces that aren't being used, and poor optimization of the existing infrastructure. So we're not saying there's no potential for that. Just based on what Christina's saying, we've got to be realistic about the bounds of that. And one of the things that really constrains your ability to act there is the granularity of sensing and control you have in these sort of rich infrastructures. And as organizations have to hire contractors in to fix bits and have changes of staff, it's really easy to lose that sort of organizational knowledge of what's plugged into what. When you read that meter, is it that building or that building plus the corridor next door, and someone puts an experiment in, that kind of thing. But you can help detect some avoidable energy waste, and you can do useful comparisons across the estate, but being mindful of what you're comparing with what. And I think that's something that's really come out. Do you want to do this one?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess this slide should have been the one I ended on. I think it's perfect for now, actually, and summarizes, I think, everything we've been saying in a slightly different way. But yeah, learning about the data quality and the coverage and sort of the provenance of the data, like why is this data being collected in the first place, really helps, helps context. I'm just saying context all the time. I think it's learn and improve the data quality and coverage does have benefits. I'm just repeating what Adrian said. Complexity of demand is also what Adrian just said about how buildings are almost never directly comparable. But also something that I think is important to highlight as well from Christina's work, and it's that the base loads are rising, and people don't always know why, and that can relate to the normal business operations that are going on, but question mark. We've really enjoyed, I guess. Well, I've personally enjoyed the tools and probing for context and complexity, because I quite like understanding systems and their complexity. So I think doing more of that is really useful and is already happening in energy management. I just don't think we're all talking about it when we're talking about data-driven tools and AI tools. It's sort of here's a list of things you can do. Off you go, make this change, or this one's bad, go and turn it off. And I would like to see more complexity and context in that kind of stuff. And then, yeah, the big one for me is machine readable contextual information. So we can do some more of this sort of computational analysis with context. And I think we're hoping to do a little bit more work on that through the dashboards and through some of the work I'm doing as well. And then, yeah, and back to Adrian. Seamlessly, but I guess it's the big, long, complex one.
Yeah, so these are the cautionary notes, I guess, the learnings of having engaged with stakeholders, various stakeholders over the lifetime of the project. Be aware that infrastructures, I mean, maybe you are already aware that infrastructures have different granularities in terms of their sensing control and reliability, and we've seen numerous examples where anomalies have come about because of misconfigured data loggers or mislabeled meters or kind of lost knowledge in the organization. I think there's a really difficult question about how do you demonstrate the speculative and future value of context as your organization changes over the years. But we just simple things like, okay, so when did that building open then, or which air conditioners in particular did you change during COVID, so that you can start to sort of make sense of growing energy demands, or where the step changes are that you detect as anomalies. Are they really anomalies? Are they failures? Are they, the result of some kind of underlying organisational policy change? And sort of disambiguating that is very hard without additional data, and it turns out to be surprisingly hard to get hold of. So I guess most estates are the result of years of evolution and are the result of changes in business strategy, outsourcing, liability and risk, and the use of sort of approved people to do various things. And when someone retires and all that's in their head, it's sort of lost. So I think there's some work there for organisations to do to kind of capture the knowledge before it's lost. And just probably little things like tracking capital planning projects, tracking logging changes would help as a resource. Always fighting the battle of affordability. There's clearly lots we could do with some of the buildings, especially around heating control and more granular sort of sensing of how the building is being used, or integration. Let's say you want to integrate with a timetabling system just to work out a correlation between room use and control. It turns out that it's very hard to raise the capital internally to put software developers on that task to bring those systems together, and making that business case. We found all the stakeholders we've talked to found that incredibly hard, which is limiting. And then I suppose just a slightly more speculative one. It's always easier as an organisation not to take the risk, and these things like we'd like access all the meters on the critical infrastructure of the university, or we'd like to track where people are on campus so we can correlate where people are with the energy use. These are questions that are quite thorny. Who takes responsibility for those? Who's going to give permission for those? These can be real barriers to exploring innovative analysis, just simply because it's risky for the organisation to get it wrong. I suppose we have put a demo online. We've spent quite a lot of time trying to get a sanitized data set that the institution are happy for us to put online on our website, and we put the anomaly tools up there, and we put a dashboard demo up there. So I guess people can go and have a play. We will obviously make the slides available to you all as well, and you can sort of find out more what we've been working on. So I guess that's it. Link to the website. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today. Bit of a warts and all reflection on how the sort of journey, the research through design journey, and what we've learned. You can find out more on the website. If you're interested in talking about the design tools, the thinking tools, the workshop tools that Oliver's mentioned, we're running some workshops, and please get in touch directly with him. Otherwise, I guess probably get in touch with me, and I'll put you in touch with the relevant members of the team. If you're a real data science stats person and you want a stats head, I can introduce you to Idris Ekli, who's one of my co-investigators who's led the anomaly detection work. I think that's everything, isn't it? Yep. Okay, happy to take some questions. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting presentation. We had some reflections here. Marcus was saying that finding building management systems with single sensors is something he is very familiar with. So clearly not a challenge that just you have come up against. And Kirsty Hennigan from Re-Energize is offering to reach out. So I will pass those contact details on to you as well after the presentation. We had one question here from David Orr. Did the team use systems engineering tools such as DOORS, all in capitals, to analyze buildings and areas?
We didn't. I can't say I'm familiar with the methodology, but if it's something we need to know about, I'll happily go and do some homework on that. I think we can thank our facilities management and our information services people for where they have supported us. They've been engaging with us for a long period of time and coming to design workshops. But this has been quite a battle to get people's time and access throughout the process, because it's not most people's day job in the organisation, and it's certainly not what our systems team are supporting for the organisation. There's no budget for them really to help them do this. So any methodology that involves a lot of their time, I would say, would be problematic. and that's probably true of most institutions who, especially as the institutions get smaller, so the resources to do in-house data science on energy data seems to diminish. That would be another observation, right? So any tools we put out there that can speed up this analysis, speed up the context gathering, help them make genuine sense of the data. It's easy to put your buildings in a rank of energy use. It's hard to understand why that is, right? You have to go and look into what's being done in those spaces to make real sense of it. So tools that we help them in that space would really help, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you. So the next question here is from Steve. I imagine many universities are looking at building management systems or have them in place. Have you shared any learnings from your research projects with these other universities? And have you found any ways to best support each other?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We're in some discussions with JISC, aren't we, about what we can share across the sector. I suppose in terms of our own housekeeping, I was invited onto the procurement panel for a new energy dashboarding system, and I'm certainly feeding into the procurement process for that and trying to ensure essentially there's an integration of systems that needs to happen that doesn't always happen, which is, facilities are often tracking what's changing on campus, but that metadata needs also to go in with the energy data, and people often see energy data as a silo and think you can make sense of the data just from the energy data. And what you've got is a bunch of stuff, right? What meter is that? What is it connected to? Is that how long did we spend just trying to work out which meters were the main meters for which buildings, or even if a building had a main meter, because there are 3 different versions within the facilities. So these stakeholders.
Just to, I guess that we're on our list, and through some of our contacts, we're looking at engaging with the Northwest Energy, one of the Northwest Energy Management networks, but we're happy to be introduced as well to other networks. If you think there's perhaps obvious or common sense things that we could, import or share with a group that might help, spark some movement through some of the frustrations that energy management and stakeholders are facing, that we happily take those.
So I guess
we're in that sort of phase of the project by communicating outwards. So
absolutely. We've got about 6 months to wrap up. Really, I think we are interested in working with people on sharing the learnings. We've obviously written papers which contain a lot of these lessons, but what we want to have is resources on the website that are much easier to engage with. We were talking about a video, weren't we? And some sort of white paper type stuff. But if people have suggestions or can think you should really talk to these people or this standards body or whatever, then please do put us in touch. So the timing is really good for that. Also, I guess if you're developing products in this space and you want to talk to us, just follow up. We'd be very happy to talk to you.
Brilliant. That sounds great. So I guess another question that I had was related to sort of the next steps. Did your improved dashboarding or analysis highlight any buildings to the university on the campus that maybe should be prioritized for retrofit projects or sort of automations or other interventions that could help reduce energy demand?
I think to some extent. So just for context, we're building, as a campus, we're building a new big energy centre with a lot of PV and heat pumps, and we're extending the district heating. So there should be a lot of transformation around the heat load soon. And I think we'd be able to say from our data where the sort of biggest kind of heat problems are around the campus. So we've been doing some analysis and dashboarding around heat flowing in and out of buildings, and that's quite useful. I don't know that we've really found. There's been surprises like sporadic high energy use in buildings you wouldn't expect, and some of the anomaly detection work has taken us in that direction. But I think in terms of the ranking of building intensity, I'm looking at you, Christian, I think there aren't really surprises there.
Well, so we have had and still have regular exchange sessions with facility management, and whenever we open the dashboard and let them play around, there are insights, but they are mainly about the meter in this building seems to be broken, so let's fix it. And so there are those sort of insights. But I guess going back to the 3 key insights that Adrian mentioned earlier, Oftentimes the fixing the broken meters is almost more priority than actually reducing energy waste, because it just overshadows anything and makes the insights gained sometimes difficult to get out of the interface when it's just all the broken meters just put everything out of proportion.
Yeah, I suppose it's not the lack of insights, it's the lack of business case. So it's sort of easier to raise money to change the generation than it seems to reduce the demand. Sort of, that could pragmatic thing that you want to go around insulating a lot and improving the granularity of the infrastructure a lot. Yet it seems surprisingly hard to find money to do that. But to put in an innovative new generation technology actually seems easier to argue. But ultimately, we have to reduce the demand, I think.
Yeah, so some of the work that Adam has done around the heat network, which is adjacent to this project, because Adam's doing his PhD and just random projects, was they noticed that the heat network wasn't it wasn't putting the heat coming back into the district. The combined heat and power was hotter than there was expected. So there's some problems around valves and things. And so that working with this data set and doing that analysis allowed them to sort of pinpoint and learn where those problems were and then fix some of the heat network, or at least prioritize repairs and retrofits there. So specifically, I guess, that's an example of where it's helped. Like this kind of.
That's a good point. Actually, we've so one of our number, Adam, who was doing his PhD across facilities and us, he's built a whole graph ontology thing which organizes some of this context, and it can say things like that's an input and that's an output, and then you can sort of look at the ratios and things, and so far that has found these problems with the heating system. It has found we had a big water leak on part of the campus, and you can look at the sum of the water going in, and then there should be less water that's being used than the meter is measuring, so you can start to do some sort of mass balance analysis and things like that. So I think once you start to get the context together with the metrics, you can start to get some insights about where these are going. I mean, we didn't find a massive. We found lots of little things that matter rather than big things. Probably, other than I really think the next thing I'd want to get to is how do you start to disaggregate the base load more so that you can start to understand what your persistent loads are. And just anecdotally, everyone here is investing in large data centers with lots of GPUs to do machine learning. That's going to have a knock-on effect for the energy demand of the campus. And I think they're going to see an uptick of energy demand on the campus as a result of that. But are we logging the right information to capture that? Probably not.
Yeah, but that's really exciting. I guess if you could continue monitoring sort of how the story evolves with these new generation technologies going in as well, it would be certainly a very interesting case study to see what impact that can have. I guess I think it was Kristen, you mentioned spending some time as well with the energy managers and the facilities managers and kind of sitting down with them, looking at dashboards. How would you say has their engagement with understanding and using energy data changed over the course of this project? Because I guess some of them may have been fairly used to looking at kind of like the standard building management type tools. Some of them maybe less so. Do you feel like there was kind of like a good exchange of knowledge and skills through this engagement?
Yeah, it was definitely interesting in a two-way learning process. So we obviously learn more of how they work, what they think. We also had a change of facility management in the middle of the project, which is another interesting aspect. But yeah, so there was we definitely observed that their understanding of the entire system, but also the complexity of the data underneath just grew, and it helped us then to make our tools more interesting for them and develop more tools and more access points for them to investigate. So like as Adrian just mentioned, Adam, the PhD student on the project, he built an entire dashboard in Grafana, in addition to the graph ontology database, and that is very essential now for to give the energy manager
One banana,
Can I add two things? I think when working with sort of more early career energy stakeholders, like there's been an excitement and a curiosity to experiment and try and ask different questions and play, which we've observed, and that's been an enjoyable experience and sort of like seeing how they've worked with us. But there's also been for people who've been doing it a long time are frustrated with the data quality, and there are some sort of like really locked in views on like the problems that we should be tackling like through the things that we've been building. So it's been sometimes we've had to deal with those sort of like strong and loud voices in diplomatic ways, because you always get that whenever you do sort of participatory research. There's always going to be people who are like, no, this is the thing you should do, go and do it. Just to add a bit more flavour there, just.
I think we're going to have to give up our meeting room. So we're probably at the end of the scheduled slot anyway, aren't we? But
yeah, that's fine. So yeah, thanks again for presenting today. And yeah, as there was a question earlier, the recording will obviously be online, and slides will be sent out as well. So thanks everyone for joining, and yeah, hopefully you found this a very interesting and useful session.
Thank you very much. I think we've enjoyed it, and we look forward to chatting to people afterwards. Bye-bye now.
Fantastic. Thank you. Bye-bye.